Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to join speakers before me in congratulating you on your election as Speaker of this honorable chamber. I have no doubt that you will do an exemplary job, and I wish you God's richest blessings and the very best. Mr. Speaker, I stand in this honorable house to give my steadfast support to the 2018-2019 estimates of revenue and expenditure, and to make my contribution to this budget on behalf of the people of Soufriere, Jacques. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Almighty God for His continued blessings on me and giving me the strength in my service to my constituents and the people of this beloved country. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to the proud people of Soufriere Jacques who afforded me the opportunity to serve their interest in this Parliament. And I want to assure them, Mr. Speaker, that I take this responsibility with the highest gratitude and humility. Mr. Speaker, they can be assured that every time I stand here in this honorable house, and especially in a budget process, is to serve their interest to guarantee they get a fair share of the economic pie. Mr. Speaker, my presentation in this round of debate will be twofold. First, I will speak to the programs within my Department of Physical Planning as reflected in the estimates. And secondly, I will state the benefits that the 2018-2019 estimates will bring to my constituency of Soufriere Jacques. Mr. Speaker, before I go into the content of the path articulated, I would like to commend the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the staff of the Department of Finance, particularly the Budget and Research Policy Units, for the dedication in putting together this year's estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, I want to tell them that their hard work and services are well appreciated by the government and the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, what's happening today is a pure portrayal of fiscal wisdom in presenting this budget of the upcoming financial year before the end of the 2017-2018 financial year. Mr. Speaker, we as a government have realized the importance of early implementation of capital projects, and therefore we must and will put all measures and mechanisms in place to ensure that this objective is achieved. Mr. Speaker, this is why we are here before the end of this financial year in presenting this new estimate of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that this is the first time in many years of this budget process that an administration has come to this honorable house to present a budget ahead of a new financial year. That is commendable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it shows how strategic that this government thinks and clearly confirms of how serious we take our fiscal responsibility and accountability to the people of St. Lucia. And I look forward for us as a government, Mr. Speaker, to present next year's estimates and even earlier than this year. Mr. Speaker, as I thoroughly review the budget summary, I am convinced and optimistic that the fiscal position of this country is moving in a positive direction. Contrary, Mr. Speaker, to what we've heard from the critics and naysayers on the opposite side. Mr. Speaker, the summary of the estimates clearly shows that we have done well with the fiscal management of this economy after the first year of this administration's fiscal budget. Mr. Speaker, it shows that this government of workers, yes, we are the government of workers, Mr. Speaker, we are committed with the work and the change the people of St. Lucia elected us to do. Mr. Speaker, in looking intensely at the estimates, we can well say that over 60% of the government's capital expenditure in the last financial year was implemented. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, if we get to the point where we can implement at least 80% of our capital expenditure, the numbers will be totally different. Mr. Speaker, looking at the figures of the estimates, it shows that total revenue and grants increased over the approved estimates in the previous year by $18 million. With all the maladies that we inherited on June the 6th, 2016 from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, the estimates clearly show that the primary balance moved from an overall deficit of $50.8 million to a surplus of $16.2 million, Mr. Speaker. That, Mr. Speaker, is an achievement. While the overall deficit improved, Mr. Speaker, from $220.9 million to $163.9 million. Again, Mr. Speaker, another achievement. Mr. Speaker, this government promised fiscal prudence. And Mr. Speaker, this is not all talk, as it is demonstrated in our ability to reverse the deteriorating trend in the primary and overall balances. To date, Mr. Speaker, the policies of this government are already beginning to bear fruit. And this, Mr. Speaker, is reflective in the improved economic growth rate of 3% and the remarkable reduction in unemployment. This, Mr. Speaker, shows the level of confidence in this government's strategic interventions and support from the wider community. Mr. Speaker, if I may adopt the words of my parliamentary colleague from Labrie, before I proceed to normal navigation, allow me, Mr. Speaker, to respond to statements or requests or pleas made by members opposite in the deliberations yesterday afternoon and evening, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, despite all the thumbs down, all the negativity which was asserted on the estimates of revenue and expenditure by the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, the member for Castries East made a plea to pave the roads in Masha, Mr. Speaker, despite his no confidence in the estimates. But, Mr. Speaker, the question you have to ask yourself is, what was the member for Castries East and the leader of the opposition doing for the people of Masha for the past 20 years? A member, Mr. Speaker, who was the Deputy Prime Minister for 15 years. He held many ministerial portfolios. Months ago, Mr. Speaker, he was the Minister of Infrastructure. But today, Mr. Speaker, he comes in this honorable house asking another man to do his job for him. Mr. Speaker, hypocrisy and misrepresentation of the people. But you know, Mr. Speaker, we are a government of the people and for the people. And once the resources are available, the Minister of Works on this side of the House is going to pave the road for the people of Masha, Mr. Speaker. We are going to pave it. Mr. Speaker, he spoke about less allocation for public assistance but more for consultancy. I'm very happy he realize that this government have been able to block a lot of $5 holes, and therefore we need less public assistance in Masha. Mr. Speaker, it seems like the words victimization and vindictiveness is very common from members on the opposite side. And the member for Castries South and Castries East said that this side of the House is a vindictive government. We victimize people. And the member for Castries East, Mr. Speaker, had the audacity to say that this government is victimizing public servants and creating fear in them, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that is a strong statement. And we have to respond to that statement, Mr. Speaker. We have to. Because, Mr. Speaker, never before in the politics and the governance of this country that public servants who are party hacks of the Labour Party, disciples of the Labour Party, never before they have become more emboldened in this country, Mr. Speaker. Never before. Whether it's on social media, whether it's in the public domain, even at the ministries, they tell people, they tell the electorate, the taxpayers who come for service, where they stand and how they feel, Mr. Speaker. What have we done to victimize them?
Exactly. Good point.
We have not done anything to victimize public servants because we respect the work that they do, the services that they provide for this country, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I need to remind the members opposite of affirmative action. Not all public servants are party hacks. Some of them, you know that. Some of them are party hacks, not all of them. Okay? Mr. Speaker, I need to remind them of affirmative action. Which party introduced affirmative action? Which simply means labor first. I need to ask them, Mr. Speaker, and remind them of Siberia. Which party? And maybe the member for Kashmir South could tell us about Siberia. He was in the public service back then when it was introduced.
He created it.
He could tell us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they could tell us all the public servants, all the private people they took from outside and parachuted them into the public service ahead of hard-working public servants who are given it all, Mr. Speaker. Wasn't that victimization and vindictiveness? Wasn't that victimization? Mr. Speaker, right here in this honorable house, we have colleague members on this side who have gotten victimized by members on the opposite side. Take, for example, Mr. Speaker, the member from Grosdile. When he came from studying in the US, he was working in the Ministry of Youth and Sports. He was frustrated. There was no officer, youth officer for Grosdile, for Castries in this basin. They sent him down to Soufriere as youth officer with only 300 miles traveling for the month. Yeah? Yes, it is true. I wish he was there. Yes, 300 miles traveling. They did everything because they heard that he was going to be the candidate for Grosdile. He was brought to the Public Service Commission. And the member for Castro South, who was the PS at that time, was upset when the Public Service Commission did not discipline him. He resigned and did contest the seat. And I'm so happy that he won in 2006. And 2007, we had World Cup cricket going on, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. Who was the CEO of World Cup cricket?
He kept you. Are you talking about victimizing?
Member for Kashmir South. But his assertion was that we formed the government, the member for Grosdile became Minister of Youth and Sports, he would have been fired.
That's right.
But no, the member for Grosdile said that I was told you're doing a good job. And I have no problems with that. I have no problems with that. You go ahead. That is the compassion and the love of the United Workers' Party. That is it. That is it. We have the member from Babuno, Mr. Speaker. We have the member from Babuno. After the defeat of the 2011 elections, was selling vegetables and fruits to marketing board until they gave him a small weekly contract. An operative of the Labour Party met him in 2012, 2013, asked him what he's doing there. Oh, I'm just selling a few vegetables and fruits. I have a little contract with the fellas. Very small. Next week, he's getting a call from marketing board. We no longer need your services. Because they call and say to cancel the contract. They call to cancel the contract. And maybe the member from Beaufort North could tell us where that call came from, Mr. Speaker. Maybe. Wasn't that victimization? And you all stand in this honorable house every single time we have a meeting of this chamber, okay? And telling the people of St. Lucia, we victimize, we are vindictive. Trying to score cheap political points, Mr. Speaker. Cheap political points. Mr. Speaker, you have the member from Kashmir South yesterday. Yesterday, the member of Kashmir South is playing for a playing court at Fula Show and playing field at Goodlands. Honorable member, your party have represented Kashmir South for 20 years. And they could not build a playing court at Fula Show. Do some introspection, honorable member, and maybe you are on the wrong side of the house, honorable member. But after 20 years, you cannot come in this house and ask for a playing court at Fula Show. And you gave
Honorable member for Soufriere. Okay? Honorable member for Soufriere. You can remain standing. Remain standing. You address the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also want to let the member for Kashmir know that work is being continued on the Kolobet viewing point. And maybe if he comes down to Soufriere during the day to do his meetings, he would have known that. But Mr. Speaker, I shall now proceed to the business of the people, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Physical Planning, Mr. Speaker, the estimates of expenditure for 2018-2019. Mr. Speaker, the total budgeted estimates for the Department of Physical Planning for the financial year 2018-2019 stands at $23,101,101, of which recurrent expenditure represents 40%, or $9,185,500, and capital expenditure represents 60% of $13,915,601. Mr. Speaker, there is an increase in recurrent expenditure over last year's approved estimates by approximately $600,000. Of that amount, the demolition fund for the DCA, $50,000, and this fund, Mr. Speaker, has not been allocated for many years, and we believe it is critical at this juncture to re-establish this fund in order to manage unauthorized development. Mr. Speaker, as you may know, the DCA plays a major role in the developmental agenda of the country, and so it is important to ensure that this organization meets challenges in the 21st century and beyond. During the upcoming policy debate in this honorable house, Mr. Speaker, I will indicate the government's intention on the way forward with respect to the DCA. Survey and mapping section, Mr. Speaker, supplies and materials, an allocation of $36,000. And this refers to the purchasing of needed tools and equipment for the surveyors and survey technicians, Mr. Speaker. Purchase of new software, AutoCAD, $176,998, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it is very unfortunate to note that our professionals, architects, surveyors, technicians, etc., have been operating without licensed software products for many, many years. And if left unchecked, Mr. Speaker, could have serious legal implications for the government. To this end, the department has been in discussions with the authorized agency of AutoCAD software and have agreed to a payment mechanism going forward. Mr. Speaker, we have to avoid unnecessary legal battles, and therefore we need to take the necessary measures to safeguard against any litigation. Funding positions, $139,402. Mr. Speaker, this provision is to fund several positions within the department. Position of Deputy Commissioner of Crown Lands, and that is to provide the necessary administrative support to the Commissioner of Crown Lands, management of the Crown Lands Office, business continuity in the absence of the Commissioner. What you find, Mr. Speaker, is that if the commissioner is on vacation or sick leave, everything comes to a standstill. So we need a deputy to continue the operations of that section. Crown Lands Assistant to provide additional support to the Crown Lands Officer. And 3 building officers, Mr. Speaker, to provide more island-wide coverage in fulfillment of the responsibilities of the work program of the physical department section, physical planning, section. Mr. Speaker, in the policy debate, I will elaborate further on the importance of funding those positions and the strategic interventions they will support. Land registry, mold remediation and cleaning, a figure of $100,000, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the documents in the land registry, that is the land registers and parcel files, have become very fragile over time. Some of these documents are very old, dusty, and in a number of cases have been infected with mold buildup, Mr. Speaker. This has caused several inconveniences to the public using our offices, and more critical, Mr. Speaker, to the occupational safety and health to our staff at the land registry. As a result, the department has no choice but to implement a deep cleaning exercise program aimed at one hand to reduce mold buildup and the other hand reduce further deterioration of the land registers and files contained therein. This, I may add, has also brought much relief to the staff members, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, the cleaning regime is costing government approximately $25,000 per quarter. This is unacceptable. And Mr. Speaker, in the policy debate, I will articulate a new program that will not only bring relief to the staff, but will reduce costs to the taxpayers. Capital program of the department, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, land acquisition. The total approved capital program for the Department of Physical Planning is $13,915,601, Mr. Speaker. Out of the amount budgeted for the financial year, 99.4% represents outstanding payments for acquisition of lands to debtors totaling $13,150,000. Mr. Speaker, the budgeted figure for land acquisition, like I said, is $13,150,000. The figure is further broken down to include a payment of $9,140,000. This payment represents a cabinet conclusion, Mr. Speaker, whereby the government of St. Lucia agreed to the issuance of fixed-rate bonds in the amount of $32 million to settle the outstanding liabilities of the government for acquisition of lands. 21 parcels of land, Mr. Speaker, was acquired for the purpose of tourism, agriculture, and housing in the quarters of Beaufort, Labrie, and Mikwood. The term of repayment is 7 semi-annual payments, with the first repayment on November 30th, 2015, and the final repayment due on October 1st, 2018. To date, 5 semi-annual payments totaling $22,850,000 have been made, Mr. Speaker. This figure of $13,150,000 represents 28.5%, Mr. Speaker, of the estimated total amounts outstanding to debtors for lands acquired by government. The estimated figure today, Mr. Speaker, stands at $46,117,101. Please note, Mr. Speaker, these are known acquisitions, because every week you get people coming to the department claiming payment for land acquisitions back in the 70s, 80s, and so on. That's known. Land acquisitions over 46 million in debt. This is a very worrying trend, Mr. Speaker, to which end I have asked the department to undertake a comprehensive exercise to determine the full outstanding cost to government. Again, Mr. Speaker, I will provide this House during the policy debate government's plan to significantly reduce this cost to the taxpayers of the country. Computerization of land registry and automation of databases of land. Mr. Speaker, the computerization of the land registry and automation of databases of land accounts budget is roughly 1.7% of the total capital program of $399,843. This represents, Mr. Speaker, an increase of 48.4% in allocation when compared to the prior financial allocation. This is mainly as a result of the additional resources required to complete the balance of the scanning of the land registry documents complete in the first phase of the project. Please note, Mr. Speaker, that this first phase of scanning of the land registry files has been undertaken for at least 10 years with no end in sight. So for the past 10 years, they've been scanning the documents with no end in sight, Mr. Speaker, at a cost of $2,864,932. Mr. Speaker, we have to do better, we must do better, and we will do better. We will bring this first phase of that scanning project to an end. Mr. Speaker, in the policy debate, I will expound on new methodology that would bring this project to completion and certainly revolutionize the way we conduct business at the land registry. Given the foregoing, there is no doubt that this project is of critical national importance. Modernization of the St. Lucia geodetic network, Mr. Speaker. Modernization of the St. Lucia geodetic network program accounts for less than 1% of the estimates of expenditure, or $180,136 for the financial year 2018-2019. Notwithstanding, there are several other initiatives that will support this program and is funded under Component 2 of the Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Project, DVRP, Mr. Speaker, within the Department of Economic Development, Transport, Housing, and Urban Renewal. Together, Mr. Speaker, these initiatives will bring about greater economic, social, and environmental benefits to the government and people of St. Lucia. Some of those benefits include development of flood mitigation models and strategies, mapping and monitoring of locations, example, flora and fauna for conservation purposes, Mr. Speaker, vertical control monitoring of ports, water tables or catchments, dams, sea level, slippage, seismic activity, and more accurate and efficient river and coastal mapping, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the policy debate, I will further explain government strategic interventions under this program and the several components that will be undertaken in this financial year. Mr. Speaker, I now move on to matters relating to my constituency, Soufriere for Jacques. As I review the estimates of revenue and expenditure for 2018-2019 financial year, Mr. Speaker, it pleases me to see the allocations under the various heads which will benefit my constituency. Mr. Speaker, I refer you to page 486, head 4306, line item 2A7, where the Minister of Finance have allocated $3,338,815 for a West Coast Road upgrade. Mr. Speaker, the use of the West Coast Road contributes significantly to the economic development of this country, particularly Soufriere. The last administration for many years, Mr. Speaker, never allocated a dollar to the West Coast Road. And now it is in urgent need of upgrade, and I'm very happy that the Minister for Infrastructure, member for Castries North, articulated our plans for upgrading the West Coast Road. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to also thank the Minister for Infrastructure for some of the works which he has undertaken in my constituency. I want to thank him, Mr. Speaker, for the works that he did on the Belplain Road, the complete rehabilitation of this road. The people of Belplain are very happy, and we look forward to the continued support of the Ministry of Infrastructure with the rehabilitation of many roads in the constituency. Mr. Speaker, under the same head on page 485, line item 240, there is an allocation for bridges and culverts. And Mr. Speaker, my people of Deville, Font-Jean-Libre, and Mont-Lacroix and commuters have to traverse in the path of the first Deville River to get to their destinations, Mr. Speaker. Also, that same route is being traversed by persons from Choiseul, the Delcere, Industry, and Lackwet areas. And what happens is that, Mr. Speaker, the people, when they get to the river, those who are on foot, they have to remove their shoes and walk in the water to cross and put it back on. The kids as well who go to Les Etats Combined School, they go through the same process. So I am making a plea to the Department of Infrastructure for the placement of a Bailey Bridge over the first Deville River from Etangs, so that the people of Fort-Jean-Libre, Deville, and Mont-Lacroix could get some relief, Mr. Speaker. I also want to thank the member for Castries North, Minister for Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, for the retaining walls construction at Colombet at Touvaillan, and those walls were dilapidated from Hurricane Thomas and the Christmas Eve trough, respectively. These works, Mr. Speaker, structurally reinforces our landscape and help mitigate against the effects of natural disasters which scarcely spare us with its wrath. Also want to thank the Honorable Member and Minister for Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, for the desilting works done this past financial year, and look forward to an extension of the desilting scope in this 2018-2019 financial year, to extend it to the Fonkaku area, Ravinclair, and even the Crestland area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I refer you to page 493 under the head 4602, line item 218, where there is an allocation towards village tourism. Mr. Speaker, this allocation builds capacity and will ensure that the tourism income is proportioned to all parts of the country through innovative investments. This will create a strong foundation, Mr. Speaker, for additional tourism entrepreneurs, and in my constituency of Soufriere Jacques, we have seen the innovative ways to tap into this tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, we have many Airbnb accommodations where residents have modified their dwellings into small guest houses and inns in Soufriere. And I'm looking at dwellings, inns like Tessa's Inn, Friends, Alfred's Hardware, Shaker Mill, Mr. and Mrs. George Guest House. They have all turned them into Airbnb accommodations, Mr. Speaker. We also have a young man from Ravinclair, Sylvanus Calix, Mr. Speaker, who have established the Grand Eden Estate, where there is a nature trail and farm tour at Dewash in Fort Jacques. And this initiative, Mr. Speaker, creates off-season farm employment and promotes environmental conservation. And soon, Mr. Speaker, we are going to have the establishment of the Fort Jacques agro-tourism landscape and many other investments in the Soufriere Basin. This means that tourism development is being decentralized from the center of the town to the rural parts of the constituency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must say that the boosting of village tourism enterprises will impact positively on our economy and our sustainability. Mr. Speaker, moving forward, I refer you to page 509 of the estimates under the head 5602, line 204, where the Minister of Finance have allocated $18,610,488 for constituency development program. Mr. Speaker, this program proves time after time that it is very significant to this country, and it is clear for all to see the results of this program. The CDP is a unique medium, Mr. Speaker, for the strengthening of our infrastructure while promoting community participation in the development of our constituencies. The last financial year, Mr. Speaker, with the allocation from this program, we were able to transform many lives and enhance our infrastructure, and this is guaranteed to continue with this year's allocation. Mr. Speaker, many drains were constructed to safeguard against public and personal property. Footpaths and roads were constructed so that residents no longer needed 2 or 3 pairs of shoes when they leave their homes. Repairs were done to school furniture, Mr. Speaker, which were not acceptable to be in the classroom. And these are only a few areas of improvements. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that this allocation will continue to develop our constituencies. Mr. Speaker, under the same head, the next line item 205 There is an allocation towards Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Project in the amount of $26,971,553. This allocation, Mr. Speaker, will benefit my constituency enormously with the undertaking of flood mitigation works this financial year. I'm also looking at, Mr. Speaker, from this allocation for the commencement of the new Soufriere Hospital, Mr. Speaker, under the DVRP program. An assessment was done of the Soufriere Hospital, Mr. Speaker, and the report concludes that the hospital's present location is vulnerable due to the path of the river, which impedes access, and any mitigating works will cost exorbitantly. Mr. Speaker, it's as if the report wasn't conclusive enough. We had, and I am certain that you're aware of, its further misfortunes with 2 consecutive fires weeks apart. Mr. Speaker, this has affected the delivery of health services, and as the Mecca of tourism, we must ensure we are able to deliver a world-class healthcare service to our residents and visitors. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to say that we are nearing acquisition of lands, and we are looking forward to commence construction of this new hospital by the end of the second quarter of this financial year. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the medical and auxiliary staffs of the Soufriere Hospital for the service in ensuring that residents and visitors receive medical assistance under the present circumstances. Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased for the allocation on page 511 under head 5702, line item 211 for local community projects in the amount of $1.4 million. I would like to applaud my government, Mr. Speaker, in bringing back an allocation to constituency councils to foster local development, and it's a start to once again empower local government. Mr. Speaker, this will aid mayors and chairpersons at the local level to address the nibbling issues that they encounter daily. Mr. Speaker, I know the constituency councils have been operating with very little resources, and I thank them immensely on behalf of the government for their service towards national development. Mr. Speaker, when I listened to the front speech and I reviewed the allocations for Ministry of Equity on page 499 on the head 5103, it highlights the seriousness of this government to address the social challenges and to provide protection to our society. Mr. Speaker, line item 268 with the allocation towards community after-school program. This program, Mr. Speaker, is bearing fruit and meeting its objective. Mr. Speaker, my constituency have had many success stories coming from this program, and we need to ensure its continuation. Many of the students who are in this program did remarkable, Mr. Speaker, at the last common entrance examination, considering the circumstances. I listened to the students, Mr. Speaker, which were enrolled in a steel pan program, played melodiously at our Soufriere Independence celebration. Mr. Speaker, the students have talent, and all they need is some guidance to nurture it. The story doesn't stop there, Mr. Speaker, as those same students grow crops in the school garden, which they use for the nutritional part of the program, and the surplus is taken home to be consumed. This is remarkable, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the coordinators and facilitators who are committed to ensure the success of this program. Mr. Speaker, under the same head, line item 280 makes an allocation to reform our society, our social safety nets. Mr. Speaker, I wish to applaud my government for the efforts in giving support to a program that seeks to address and provide productive inclusion to the people of St. Lucia. The continuous efforts to provide a safety net to individuals and families to protect them from poverty is critical to my constituency of Soufriere. Mr. Speaker, this is important because it demonstrates that the safety net programs will ensure a secure way of raising people out of poverty, not trapping them or keeping them in this bracket for eternity. It will also facilitate, Mr. Speaker, the access to exit strategies, which will enhance labor productivity, retain employment, and increase the ability of welfare families to respond to and recover from shocks. Mr. Speaker, the next line item 290, there is an allocation of $6,491,633 for the home care program. Mr. Speaker, it's comforting to see this allocation. And I want to thank the Prime Minister and Minister of Equity for this allocation on behalf of the persons receiving this service in my constituency. This program is very important, Mr. Speaker, and makes a huge difference in the way we care for our elderly. Mr. Speaker, a society can be judged in the manner it treats its elderly. On the same page, Mr. Speaker, line item 295, BNTF 9th program. Presently, Mr. Speaker, the first phase of Old Trafford project is being funded by BNTF 8. And the second phase of the project is designed to be the economic hub of the town with the inclusivity of all sectors, tourism, agriculture, manufacturing. And Mr. Speaker, this project is a critical component in the holistic development of the town of Soufriere, and I look forward to the financial assistance from this program, BNTF 9. Mr. Speaker, on page 501, head 5205, line item 242, an allocation of $2 million is made towards St. Lucia Education Quality Improvement Project. This allocation, Mr. Speaker, will ensure the improvement in teaching learning conditions in our schools. Our academics, Mr. Speaker, for our academics to improve, we must ensure that the environment is conducive to learning. Improving the quality of education is a critical ingredient for our human capital development, poverty alleviation, and economic growth. Mr. Speaker, this allocation goes further in safeguarding our school plant from the effects of climate change. On page 507, head 5502, line item 218, there is an allocation, Mr. Speaker, toward capacity building and awareness for the Global Environment Facility, GEF. Mr. Speaker, my constituency is presently benefiting through this program, and I am pleased for this consideration to continue to build capacity. Presently, Mr. Speaker, GEF is facilitating projects within critical areas in the Soufriere-Fonssac Basin. This program is presently implementing interventions to ensure youth development and preservation of our natural resource from ridge to reef. GEF, Mr. Speaker, is collaborating with organizations such as Rising Stars Sports Club from Palmist, the SMMA to improve on water quality, and the IWICO project in preserving our watershed, just to name a few. I am grateful for those interventions, Mr. Speaker, because the preservation and sustainability of our environment is of paramount importance. Mr. Speaker, in concluding my contribution to this debate, I want to take this opportunity to thank the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, and my cabinet colleagues for crafting these estimates of revenue and expenditure for 2018-2019, which will bring further relief to the citizens of this country. Mr. Speaker, the summary of the estimates has given this government a passing grade. It shows that we have done well after managing the fiscal affairs of the economy after the first year of our financial budget. Mr. Speaker, this administration's fiscal budget has yielded positive results, and I have no doubt that our policies will continue to lead us forward on the path of economic prosperity and success. Mr. Speaker, progress and growth is not one long race, but many short races. Mr. Speaker, we must remain focused to achieve a consistent and positive outcome. I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and honorable members for your indulgence, and once again, I solidify my support to the 2018-2019 estimates of revenue and expenditure. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.